the clock that stopped at midnight. Settle yourself into comfort now, letting the tensions of the day dissolve like morning mist beneath the warming sun. Feel the weight of your body supported completely, every muscle releasing its hold, every thought slowing to a gentle drift. Tonight, we're going to explore time itself, or rather, a moment when time decided to pause, to hold its breath, to stop its endless forward march and simply wait. This is a story whispered in the shadows of Old Town Square, a tale of mechanisms and mystery, of midnight and meaning. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself slip into the rhythm of this narrative. A story that exists outside of time, or perhaps at the very edge of it. Welcome to Hushed History, where tonight we'll stand together before a clock that stopped at midnight and never started again. To understand the significance of what happened, we must first understand the clock itself. And to understand the clock, we must understand the art and science of horology as it existed in the late 19th century. Clockmaking had by then evolved from a craft practiced by scattered artisans into something approaching an industrial process. Yet the finest clocks were still made by hand, each component carefully crafted, fitted, and adjusted by masters who understood not just mechanics but also the deeper mathematics of time itself. Our clock was such a piece, created in the year 1878 by a clockmaker named Heinrich Aldrich in his workshop in the German city of Augsburg, a place with centuries of tradition in precision metalwork and clockmaking. Aldrich was 63 years old when he received the commission that would become his masterwork. A man who had spent his entire adult life working with gears and springs, pendulums and escapements, learning the secrets of keeping accurate time in an era when precision mattered more with each passing year. Railways required synchronized schedules. Telegraph systems needed coordination across vast distances. The modern world was being built on a foundation of measured, standardized, reliable time, and clockmakers like Aldrich were the high priests of this new temporal religion. The commission came from the town of Ashford Cross, a prosperous market town in the English Midlands that had recently completed construction of a new town hall, an imposing Victorian Gothic structure of red brick and cream stone that stood at the center of the town square and represented civic pride made solid and permanent. The building featured a tower that rose 140 feet above the square, and at the top of this tower, visible from every corner of the town and from the surrounding farmland for miles in every direction, would sit the clock. But not just any clock. The town council had decided that Ashford Cross deserved a timepiece worthy of its ambitions and prosperity, something that would be talked about across the region, something that would last for generations. Aldrich spent 18 months on the project, working with 2 assistants in his Augsburg workshop, though he personally crafted every critical component. The clock face measured 12 feet in diameter, made of copper sheets painted white with black Roman numerals, each numeral carefully gilded in genuine gold leaf. The hands were wrought iron, the hour hand 6 feet long and the minute hand 8 feet, both shaped with elegant curves and counterweight for perfect balance. Behind this visible face lay the true artistry, the movement itself, a symphony of brass and steel components that would transform the steady swing of a pendulum into the measured advancement of those great hands around the dial. The pendulum that would regulate this mechanism measured 14 feet in length, suspended in the tower's shaft and swinging with majestic slowness, completing each arc in exactly 2 seconds. The bob at the pendulum's end weighed 200 pounds, cast from bronze and carefully shaped to minimize air resistance. Above this, the clock movement consisted of more than 800 individual parts, including 4 great wheels that advanced the hours and minutes, a complex escapement mechanism that converted the pendulum's swing into rotary motion, and a striking mechanism that would sound the hours on a bronze bell weighing half a ton. The power for all this came not from springs, as in smaller clocks, but from 3 great weights, each weighing 400 pounds, suspended on cables that descended through the tower. These weights would be wound up manually 3 times per week by the town's designated clock winder, a position that would become one of modest prestige in Ashford Cross, always held by someone trusted and reliable, someone who understood that the entire town regulated its life by this timepiece and that allowing it to run down would be a kind of civic betrayal. Aldrich had incorporated several innovations into his design, drawing on the latest horological research from England, France, and his native Germany. The escapement used a variant of the gravity escapement designed by Edmund Beckett Denison for the Great Clock at Westminster, a mechanism that ensured consistent force delivery regardless of variations in the driving weights or friction in the system. The pendulum rod was made of a zinc and steel combination that compensated for temperature changes, expanding and contracting in precisely balanced ways so that summer heat and winter cold would not affect the clock's rate. The whole mechanism was mounted on a massive oak frame, the timbers chosen for their stability and resistance to warping, each joint carefully crafted to allow for seasonal movement without introducing play that might affect the clock's accuracy. When the clock was finally installed in the autumn of 1879, its arrival in Ashford Cross was treated as a major event. The components had traveled by rail from Augsburg to the Channel coast, crossed to England, and then been transported by special wagons to the Midlands. Aldrich himself came to supervise the installation, spending 3 weeks in Ashford Cross as the mechanism was carefully assembled in the tower, the great pendulum hung and adjusted, the weights and cables rigged, and finally, the massive clock face bolted to the tower's exterior, visible to all. The official starting ceremony took place on November the 15th, 1879, a cold but clear Saturday afternoon. The entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the square and the streets leading to it. The mayor gave a speech about progress and permanence, about Ashford Cross taking its place among the great towns of England, about time and civic virtue. A local choir sang hymns. Children waved small flags. And then, at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as determined by the stationmaster's watch which had been synchronized that morning by telegraph with Greenwich, Aldrich started the pendulum swinging, engaged the mechanism, and the great clock began its work. The first tick was clearly audible even in the crowded square, a solid, authoritative sound that seemed to anchor the moment in time. The minute hand began its slow journey around the dial. And at 3:30 exactly, the striking mechanism engaged and the great bell sounded 30 minutes past the hour, its deep bronze voice rolling across the town and the surrounding countryside, announcing that Ashford Cross now had a voice, a heartbeat, a way of marking time that was both beautiful and precise. For the next 16 years, the clock performed flawlessly. It became the reference point for every activity in the town and the surrounding area. Farmers working in distant fields could hear the bell and know when to break for lunch, when to begin the journey home. Shopkeepers regulated their hours by it. The railway station synchronized its clocks to it. Church services began when the clock said they should begin. Factory shifts changed on its signal. Children learned to tell time by watching its great hands move across the face visible from the schoolhouse windows. Courting couples arranged to meet when the clock struck 7. Mothers called children home for supper at 6. The position of clock winder was held through most of this period by a man named Thomas Greer, a former railway worker who had been injured in an accident that left him with a permanent limp but intact his meticulous attention to detail and reliability. 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Greer would climb the 167 steps to the clock room, arriving always at 9 in the morning, and spend the next 45 minutes winding the 3 great weights, checking the pendulum swing, oiling the mechanism's bearings, and generally ensuring that everything remained in perfect order. He kept a log book, recording each winding, noting the weather, documenting any adjustments made to the regulation. In 16 years, he never missed a scheduled winding. The clock never stopped, never gained or lost more than a few seconds per week, never failed to strike the hours. The townspeople came to take it for granted, as people do with reliable things. The clock was simply there, as permanent as the stone buildings around the square, as dependable as sunrise. It marked births and deaths, weddings and funerals, market days and holy days, the slow turning of seasons and years. Its steady ticking, inaudible to those in the square but a constant presence to anyone who climbed the tower, became the sonic foundation of Ashford Cross, the rhythm beneath all other rhythms. Heinrich Aldrich died in 1888, aged 73, in his Augsburg workshop, reportedly at his workbench with tools in his hands. During that week of mourning, people noticed anew what they had learned to overlook, really looked at the clock face and appreciated its elegance, really listened to the bell and heard its perfect tone, really understood that they lived their lives in rhythm with a masterwork of engineering and craftsmanship. The tower itself became a landmark far beyond its practical function. Travelers approaching Ashford Cross from any direction saw the tower first, rising above the rooflines, the white clock face visible for miles, announcing the town's presence and importance. Artists painted it, Photographers made it the subject of innumerable images that were sold as postcards and souvenirs. The local newspaper used an engraving of the tower and clock as its masthead. When people from Ashford Cross traveled elsewhere and were asked where they were from, they often referred to it as the town with the great clock. And people would nod in recognition, having heard of this remarkable timepiece in the Midlands. By 1895, the clock had been running continuously for nearly 16 years, had ticked more than 420 million times, had moved its great hands through more than 140,000 complete circuits of the dial, had struck the hours more than 140,000 times. The mechanism showed remarkably little wear, a testament to Aldrich's genius in design and the quality of materials he had used. Thomas Greer, now in his 60s, continued his faithful service, climbing those tower steps 3 times a week, maintaining the clock with the same careful attention he had brought to the task from the beginning. That it was under these circumstances. The clock running perfectly, maintained faithfully, trusted absolutely. That the inexplicable occurred on the night of August the 27th, 1895, a Tuesday, when the clock that had never failed, never stopped, never missed a stroke, ceased its eternal progression at precisely midnight, and refused, despite all efforts, to ever run again. The night began ordinarily enough. August had been warm that year, but not excessively so, and the 27th was a pleasant summer evening, the kind where people lingered in their gardens after supper, where windows remained open to catch whatever breeze might stir, where the long twilight seemed to stretch endlessly before finally surrendering to darkness. Thomas Greer had wound the clock that morning, as he did every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and had noted in his log that all was well, the mechanism running smoothly, the weights properly raised, the pendulum swinging with its customary precision. As night fell over Ashford Cross, the clock tower stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, the clock face illuminated by gas lamps mounted behind it, making it visible even in darkness, a glowing disk of light suspended in the air above the sleeping town. The mechanism ticked steadily in its chamber. The pendulum swung its measured arcs. The great weights slowly descended on their cables as their stored energy was converted into the motion of gears and the advancement of hands. At 11 o'clock, the striking mechanism engaged and the great bell sounded, 11 deep tones rolling across the town, marking another hour past, another hour closer to midnight and the completion of another day. People in their homes heard it, as they heard every hour, the sound so familiar as to be almost invisible, noticed only in its absence. Those still awake, reading by lamplight, writing letters, attending to late chores, might have glanced at their own household clocks, confirming that they remained synchronized with the great clock, maintaining the temporal order that governed their lives. Between 11 and midnight, several people would later report having experienced unusual phenomena, though whether these experiences were genuinely anomalous or simply retrospective interpretation in light of what happened at midnight remains impossible to determine. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, who lived in a house facing the square, reported that her household clocks, she had 3, a mantel clock in the parlor, a bracket clock in the bedroom, and a wall clock in the kitchen, had all begun running fast around 11:30, gaining several minutes in the span of only a few moments before returning to normal. She noticed this, she said, because she was knitting by lamplight and using the parlor clock to time her work, planning to stop at midnight, and the clock's sudden acceleration startled her. A police constable named Robert Hadley, making his rounds through the streets near the square, reported feeling a strange pressure in the air around 11:45, a heaviness that made breathing slightly difficult and created a sense of anticipation, as if the atmosphere itself was waiting for something. He'd been a constable for 15 years and had walked those same streets on countless nights, but this felt different in a way he struggled to articulate. The air seemed denser, more substantial, and sounds carried strangely, sometimes seeming to come from the wrong direction or arriving delayed, as if traveling through something thicker than normal air. In the tower itself, the clock ticked on, oblivious to these reported disturbances, its mechanism as regular and reliable as always. The great pendulum swung, each arc identical to the millions that had preceded it. The escapement clicked with metronomic precision. The hands advanced smoothly across the dial. The weights descended slowly down their shafts, still carrying sufficient potential energy for many hours of operation. At 11:55, the clock's minute hand stood at the numeral 11, 5 minutes away from midnight, At 11:56, it advanced to a position just past the 11. At 11:57, it continued its journey. At 11:58, it was 3/4 of the way to 12. At 11:59, it approached the vertical position that would indicate midnight. Everything was proceeding exactly as it had proceeded thousands of times before. And then, at midnight exactly, as the mechanism prepared to engage the striking train that would sound 12 strokes on the great bell, something happened. The clock stopped. Not gradually, not with the slowing that would indicate the weights running down or the pendulum losing momentum. It simply stopped, instantly, as if the passage of time itself had been interrupted. The pendulum, in mid-swing, ceased its motion and hung motionless. The hands froze at 12, perfectly vertical. The mechanism, in the middle of engaging the striking train, locked in place. And the bell, which should have been sounding the first of 12 strokes to announce midnight, remained silent. The silence was profound and, to those who noticed it, deeply unsettling. For 16 years, the clock had struck every hour without fail. The sound had become part of the acoustic environment of Ashford Cross, as expected and unremarkable as birdsong at dawn. Its absence was like a missing heartbeat, a breath not taken, a word left unspoken. Those awake in the town looked up from whatever they were doing, confused, wondering if they'd somehow missed hearing the bell, checking their household clocks to confirm that it was indeed midnight and the great clock should have struck. Constable Hadley, still on his rounds in the square, witnessed the moment directly. He was looking at the clock face when midnight arrived, and he saw the hands reach the 12 and then simply stop, saw the light behind the dial flicker once, briefly, and then return to normal. He waited for the bell to sound, counted silently to himself, allowing for the few seconds between the clock showing midnight and the striking mechanism engaging. But there was no sound. The bell remained silent, and looking at the clock face, he could see that the minute hand, which should have been beginning its next journey around the dial, was not moving. His first thought was that the clock had run down, that Thomas Greer had perhaps missed a winding or miscalculated how much energy remained in the weights. But this seemed impossible. Greer was utterly reliable, and in any case, when a weight-driven clock runs down, it slows gradually, not stops instantly. His second thought was some kind of mechanical failure, a broken gear or jammed component. But the clock had been running perfectly just seconds before, and such catastrophic failures don't typically occur without warning. Hadley decided to investigate. The tower was locked at night, but as a constable, he had a key to most public buildings in the town. He let himself in through the heavy oak door at the tower's base and began climbing the spiral stone staircase that wound upward through the darkness. He carried a police lantern that cast a swinging pool of light on the worn steps, counting as he climbed 167 steps to the clock room. He reached the clock room slightly out of breath and held his lantern high to examine the mechanism. What he saw would perplex him and everyone else who subsequently investigated. The clock appeared to be in perfect condition. All the components were intact, undamaged, properly engaged. The weights hung on their cables, still carrying substantial height. Greer had wound them that morning, and they should have had energy sufficient for another day and a half of operation. The pendulum hung perfectly plumb, not swinging, but showing no sign of damage or displacement. The hands on the mechanism pointed to midnight, frozen there but not bent or broken. But the clock was absolutely, utterly still. The constant ticking that normally filled the clock room was absent, replaced by a silence that felt heavy and wrong. Hadley could hear his own breathing, the creak of his leather belt, the faint whisper of wind outside the tower, but nothing from the clock itself. It was like standing next to a corpse, something that should have life and motion but was instead simply stopped. Hadley was not a clockmaker and didn't presume to understand the complexities of the mechanism before him, but he did try the obvious intervention. He reached out and very gently pushed the pendulum, trying to start it swinging again. The pendulum moved under his hand, swung a few inches to one side, but when he released it, it simply returned to vertical and stopped, as if some invisible force was holding it in place. He tried again, pushing harder, getting the pendulum to swing through a broader arc, but the result was the same. It made a few diminishing swings and then stopped, hanging motionless despite still having momentum that should have carried it through several more oscillations. This was physically wrong. A pendulum with that much mass, hanging on a suspension that was designed to minimize friction, should continue swinging for many minutes even without the mechanism to maintain its motion. But this pendulum was stopping within seconds, as if swinging through something that rapidly absorbed its energy. Hadley felt the hair on his neck rise, a primitive response to something his conscious mind hadn't fully processed, that he was witnessing something that violated the normal rules of how physical objects behave. He tried one more thing. The mechanism had a manual crank that could be used to turn the gears and advance the hands without relying on the weights and pendulum, useful for setting the clock or testing the striking train. Hadley found this crank and tried to turn it. It wouldn't move. He applied more force, enough that he worried about damaging something, but the crank refused to budge. It was as if the entire mechanism had been welded in place, transformed from a mobile assemblage of moving parts into a single solid mass of frozen metal. Deeply unsettled now, Hadley descended the tower and went directly to Thomas Greer's home, waking the clock winder and explaining what had happened. Greer dressed quickly and returned with Hadley to the tower, climbing the stairs with his characteristic limp but moving as fast as he could, clearly alarmed. In his 16 years of maintaining this clock, it had never stopped, never failed, never given him cause for serious concern beyond routine maintenance. Greer's examination was more thorough and knowledgeable than Hadley's, and he quickly confirmed what the constable had observed. The clock had stopped at midnight, the mechanism was frozen, the pendulum wouldn't swing, and the manual crank wouldn't turn. But Greer noticed additional details that troubled him deeply. The oil he had applied to the bearings during his last maintenance was still present and fresh, exactly as it should be. There was no sign of the overheating that would occur if a bearing had seized. The gears showed no chips or breaks, no signs of the kind of catastrophic failure that might explain the sudden stoppage. Every component appeared to be in perfect condition, just not moving. Most puzzling of all, when Greer examined the weights, he found them still hanging well above the bottom of their descent. In a normal stoppage caused by the weights running down, they would have reached the bottom of their travel. But these weights were suspended with plenty of height remaining, full of potential energy that should have been driving the mechanism. It was as if the clock had simply decided to stop, despite having both the energy and the mechanical integrity to continue running. By dawn, word had spread through Ashford Cross that the great clock had stopped at midnight, and a crowd had gathered in the square, looking up at the clock face showing 12 o'clock, the hands frozen in their vertical position. The sight was deeply disturbing to many people. That clock had been the constant reference point for their lives, the reliable heartbeat of the town, and seeing it stopped felt like a kind of death, like waking to find the sun hadn't risen. The town council convened an emergency meeting and decided to bring in expert help. A telegram was sent to the British Horological Institute in London, requesting that their best clockmaker be sent to Ashford Cross immediately to examine the clock and, hopefully, restore it to operation. Within 2 days, a man named James Whitfield arrived, a clockmaker with 30 years of experience and a reputation for being able to repair any timepiece, no matter how complex or damaged. Whitfield spent 3 full days examining the Aldrich clock, taking measurements, testing components, consulting the detailed documentation that Aldrich had provided when the clock was installed. He dismantled parts of the mechanism, cleaned and inspected every component he could access, looked for any sign of the problem. His conclusion, delivered to the town council in a written report, was both definitive and baffling. The clock, Whitfield reported, was in perfect mechanical condition. Every component was sound, properly adjusted, and fully functional as far as he could determine through examination. The weights had ample energy. The pendulum was properly suspended and balanced. The gears were undamaged. The escapement was clean and properly adjusted. There was absolutely no mechanical reason why the clock should not run. And yet it wouldn't run. Whitfield had tried everything in his considerable repertoire. He had manually started the pendulum swinging dozens of times, trying different amplitudes and techniques, but it always stopped within seconds. He had disconnected various parts of the mechanism to test them individually, and each part worked perfectly in isolation. He had even attempted to run the clock without the pendulum, using the crank to manually advance the mechanism. But it wouldn't turn no matter how much force he applied. His report concluded with an admission that must have been difficult for a man of his professional pride to make. "I cannot determine the cause of this stoppage, nor can I repair it. The clock appears to be in perfect mechanical condition yet refuses to operate. This is unprecedented in my experience and defies logical explanation based on horological principles. I can only speculate that some phenomenon beyond the mechanical has affected this timepiece, though what such a phenomenon might be, I cannot say." The town council, unwilling to accept that nothing could be done, brought in additional experts over the following months. Clockmakers from Manchester, Birmingham, and London made the journey to Ashford Cross, examined the clock, and came away equally baffled. One expert suggested that the clock might have been affected by some kind of magnetic field, though he couldn't explain what might have generated such a field or why it would affect a primarily brass and bronze mechanism. Another proposed that vibrations from some distant event, an earthquake, perhaps, or industrial explosion, had somehow damaged the clock in subtle ways that weren't visible but prevented operation. But seismographs in the region had recorded no unusual activity on the night of August 27th. A particularly distinguished expert, a professor of physics from Cambridge University named Dr. Edmund Thornberry, spent a week in Ashford Cross in October of 1895, conducting what he described as a complete physical and mechanical analysis of the clock. He brought sensitive instruments to measure magnetic fields, temperature gradients, vibrations, and other physical parameters that might reveal some environmental factor affecting the clock. He found nothing unusual. The clock existed in a perfectly normal physical environment, subject to no extraordinary forces or conditions. Dr. Thornberry's report, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, became a minor sensation in scientific circles. He detailed the clock's condition, the circumstances of its stoppage, and the failure of multiple experts to explain or remedy the situation. He proposed several hypotheses, from the mundane, some hidden defect in the mechanism that appeared only under specific conditions, to the exotic, some unknown physical phenomenon that could cause a localized cessation of mechanical motion. But he admitted that none of his hypotheses adequately explained the observations, and he concluded by calling for other scientists to examine the clock and perhaps bring fresh perspectives to the mystery. Several did make the journey to Ashford Cross over the following year, and their investigations added a few additional observations to the record, though they brought no solutions. One researcher noted that compass needles seemed to behave strangely in the immediate vicinity of the clock, spinning slowly rather than settling immediately on magnetic north. Another observed that pocket watches worn into the clockroom sometimes gained or lost time erratically, though they returned to normal operation once removed from the tower. A third reported feeling distinctly unwell while in the clockroom, experiencing dizziness and disorientation that faded once he descended the tower stairs. These reports suggested that something unusual was indeed happening in or around the stopped clock, some influence or phenomenon that affected instruments and people as well as the clock itself. But what this something was remained entirely mysterious. It left no other trace, couldn't be measured directly, and seemed to have no effect beyond the immediate area of the clock and tower. The people of Ashford Cross, meanwhile, had to adapt to life without their great clock. It remained a landmark, visible from all directions, but now it was a stopped clock, forever showing midnight, a constant reminder of the night when time had somehow been interrupted. People joked grimly that it was at least correct twice a day at noon and midnight, though of course they never saw it at actual midnight because the clock face wasn't illuminated during the day, and at night when it reached the same position they were usually asleep. The stopped clock became something of a tourist attraction. People traveled to Ashford Cross specifically to see the clock that had mysteriously stopped at midnight and couldn't be restarted. They would stand in the square, looking up at the frozen hands, imagining what might have happened on that August night. The more imaginative visitors developed elaborate theories. The clock had been cursed by someone Heinrich Aldrich had wronged. It had been affected by ghosts or spirits. It marked some important event in the spiritual realm. It had stopped because it had somehow sensed a future catastrophe and refused to advance toward it. These supernatural explanations found fertile ground particularly among those inclined toward spiritualism and occult interests, movements that were quite popular in the late Victorian era. A spiritualist medium named Madame Celestine visited Ashford Cross in 1896 and conducted a séance in the clock room, claiming to sense presences there, trapped spirits or temporal anomalies that prevented the normal flow of time. Her account, published in several spiritualist journals, attracted even more visitors, particularly those interested in psychical research and paranormal phenomena. The Society for Psychical Research, a respectable organization despite its unusual subject matter, sent investigators to examine the case in 1897. Their report, while carefully worded to avoid appearing too credulous, acknowledged that the stopped clock presented genuinely puzzling features that couldn't be easily dismissed as fraud or delusion. The physical reality of the stopped clock was undeniable. It existed, it had stopped under mysterious circumstances, and multiple experts had failed to restart it. Whether this had any supernatural component remained, in their view, an open question, but they felt the case deserved further study and observation. Thomas Greer continued to visit the clock regularly, even though there was no winding to be done, no maintenance to perform on a mechanism that wouldn't move. He would climb the 167 steps, sit in the clock room, and simply spend time with the silent mechanism that had been his charge for so many years. He told people, like he'd failed in his duty somehow, though rationally he knew there was nothing he could have done differently. The clock had been perfectly maintained, had been running flawlessly right up until the moment it stopped. But still, he felt responsible, felt that he should have somehow prevented this or should know how to fix it. In his logbook, Greer continued to make entries, noting his visits to the clock room, recording the weather, documenting the unchanging state of the mechanism. These entries became increasingly melancholy, a chronicle of devoted attendance on something that could no longer respond to care. Clock still stopped. He would write, day after day, week after week. Mechanism appears unchanged. Weights suspended at same height. Pendulum motionless. Hands at 12. Weather fair. All else well. The town council eventually voted to leave the clock as it was, to make no further attempts to restart it, to preserve it as a kind of memorial to the mysterious event of August 27, 1895. They discussed installing a new clock elsewhere in the town, but there was resistance to this idea. It would feel like a betrayal somehow, an admission of defeat. The stopped clock had become part of the town's identity, had become what Ashford Cross was known for. To replace it with a working clock would be to lose something unique, however unsettling that uniqueness might be. So the great clock remained, frozen at midnight, visible from miles around, a constant presence that marked not time but rather time's interruption, not progression but rather a permanent pause. And as the years passed and the stopped clock became a familiar landmark rather than an active mystery, people began to report other strange occurrences associated with it, experiences that seemed to cluster around the midnight hour and the tower where the clock maintained its eternal silence. The first widely documented account of these phenomena came in the spring of 1898, nearly 3 years after the clock had stopped. A young woman named Elizabeth Carn, visiting Ashford Cross to see relatives, found herself in the town square late one evening after attending a concert at the Assembly Rooms. The concert had run later than expected, and she was walking alone toward her aunt's house when, according to her later testimony, she heard the clock strike midnight. This was impossible, of course. The clock hadn't struck since August of 1895, and its striking mechanism was as frozen as the rest of the movement. But Carn insisted she had heard it clearly. 12 deep tones from the great bell in the tower, each stroke deliberate and resonant, exactly as the bell had sounded during its years of normal operation. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, she reported, filling the square but also somehow internal, as if she was hearing it both with her ears and with some other sense entirely. As the bell sounded, Carn experienced what she described as a moment of displacement, as if she had somehow stepped outside of normal time. The square around her seemed to freeze, the few other pedestrians visible on the streets becoming perfectly still, a carriage in the distance suspended in mid-motion, even the wind seeming to pause. The effect lasted only for the duration of the 12 strokes, and when the final tone faded, everything returned to normal motion, the pedestrians continuing their walks, the carriage rolling on, the wind rustling the leaves in the square's trees. But Carn was left shaken. certain she had experienced something genuine and inexplicable, something connected to the stopped clock and its frozen moment. Her account might have been dismissed as imagination or fabrication, but similar reports began to accumulate. In 1899, a commercial traveler staying at the King's Arms Hotel reported waking at midnight to the sound of a clock striking, looking out his window at the tower, and seeing the clock hands moving, completing one full circuit of the dial in the space of seconds before returning to their frozen position at 12. In 1900, a group of 4 people walking home from a late social gathering all reported hearing the clock strike midnight, and all described the same sense of temporal distortion, of the world around them briefly freezing while the bell sounded. These midnight phenomena seem to occur irregularly, perhaps once every few months, reported by people who had no knowledge of earlier accounts and who were often genuinely frightened by what they'd experienced. The reports shared common features: the sound of the bell striking midnight, despite the striking mechanism being frozen, a sense of time stopping or behaving strangely, and sometimes visual distortions with the clock hands appearing to move or the clock face glowing more brightly than the gas lamps behind it could account for. In 1902, a local physician named Dr. Marcus Holloway became interested in these reports and began systematically interviewing people who claimed to have experienced the midnight phenomena. He was particularly interested because several people had reported physical symptoms, headaches, nausea, disorientation, associated with hearing the phantom bell, and as a medical man, he wondered if there might be some physiological explanation. Perhaps some kind of sound or vibration, inaudible to most people but affecting a sensitive few, was being generated by the tower or the stopped clock mechanism. Dr. Holloway conducted his own vigil in the town square on several midnight occasions, equipped with a stethoscope and other medical instruments, hoping to detect and measure whatever phenomenon might be occurring. On his third attempt, in November of 1902, he reported experiencing it himself. The bell sounded, clearly and unmistakably, 12 strokes marking midnight. He felt the temporal distortion others had described, a sense that the normal flow of time had been interrupted, and his instruments recorded unusual readings. His pulse, which had been steady at 68 beats per minute, dropped to 40 beats per minute during the bell's sounding, then returned to normal immediately afterward. His pocket watch, which he'd verified as accurate before the vigil, had gained 17 minutes by the time the phantom bell finished striking, though it resumed keeping accurate time thereafter. Most unsettling to Dr. Holloway was his own emotional response to the experience. He was a rational man, trained in science and medicine, not given to superstition or flights of fancy. But during those moments when the bell was sounding and time seemed distorted, he felt what he could only describe as profound grief, a sense of loss so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He couldn't explain the emotion, had no reason to feel sad or bereft, but the feeling was overwhelming and lasted for several minutes after the phenomena ceased. His account, published in the British Medical Journal in 1903, brought even more attention to the Ashford Cross clock and its mysteries. Dr. Holloway's reputation and careful documentation gave credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as folklore or mass delusion. He proposed that some kind of periodic disturbance was occurring in or around the stopped clock, something that affected human physiology and perception in measurable ways. What might cause such a disturbance remained unknown, but his documentation proved that something was happening, that the reports weren't simply imagination or fabrication. The attention brought researchers from various disciplines to Ashford Cross over the following years. Physicists set up monitoring equipment in and around the tower, hoping to detect unusual energy readings or field disturbances. Psychologists interviewed experiencers, looking for patterns in who reported the phenomena and under what circumstances. Geologists examined the ground beneath the tower, wondering if some underground feature might be relevant. Meteorologists checked weather records for correlations between atmospheric conditions and reported events. All of this research yielded fragmentary and frustrating results. Some investigators reported detecting small magnetic anomalies around the tower at midnight. Others found nothing unusual at all. The psychological studies revealed no consistent pattern. The experiencers came from all walks of life, all ages, all temperaments, with no obvious commonality beyond being in proximity to the tower at midnight when the phenomena occurred. The geological surveys found nothing remarkable about the site. The meteorological analysis showed no correlation with weather. What became clear was that the phenomena, whatever its nature, was genuinely intermittent and unpredictable. Some midnights passed entirely normally, with nothing unusual occurring. Others brought reports of the phantom bell, time distortions, and associated experiences. The frequency seemed to be roughly once every few weeks, but this was highly variable. Sometimes several events would be reported in quick succession, then months might pass with nothing. By 1905, a decade after the clock had stopped, the town of Ashford Cross had fully integrated its mysterious landmark into its identity. The stopped clock appeared on town stationery, in business advertisements, in tourist brochures. The King's Arms Hotel advertised itself as situated directly on the square, with views of the famous stopped clock. Guidebooks mentioned Ashford Cross primarily because of the clock, describing it as the town where time stopped at midnight, and encouraging visitors to spend an evening in the square, perhaps to witness the mysterious phenomena for themselves. Thomas Greer continued his faithful visits to the clock room until his death in 1906, aged 71. He had maintained his vigil over the silent mechanism for 11 years after it stopped, never missing his regular schedule of visits even though there was no maintenance to perform. His logbook, his final entry made just 2 days before his death, stood as a remarkable document of devotion to duty even when that duty had become symbolically rather than practically meaningful. The town gave him a funeral with full honors, and his coffin was carried past the tower he had served so faithfully, the stopped clock overhead marking the same midnight it had marked on the day he first began his service. His replacement as nominal clock winder, a position that continued despite there being nothing to wind, was a younger man named William Archer, who approached the role with a kind of reverent curiosity. Archer was interested in the mystery of the stopped clock and began his own documentation project, recording not just his visits but also any unusual phenomena reported by others, creating a comprehensive chronicle of the clock and its mysteries. Archer's journals, which he maintained until 1928, provide one of the most detailed records of the ongoing phenomena associated with the stopped clock. He documented hundreds of reports of the midnight bell, time distortions, and other unusual experiences. He noticed patterns that previous observers had missed. For instance, the phenomena seemed to occur more frequently during the week surrounding the anniversary of the original stoppage, late August into early September. They also seemed more common during clear weather than cloudy, though this correlation was far from perfect. He also documented his own regular experiences in the clock room, the sense of presence he felt there, the way time seemed to behave strangely even during daylight visits. His watch would gain or lose time erratically while he was in the room, though it worked normally elsewhere. He sometimes heard faint sounds, ticking, though the clock was silent, or distant voices speaking words he couldn't quite make out. He felt temperature variations that couldn't be explained by weather or drafts, sudden cold spots that would appear and disappear for no apparent reason. Archer was careful to maintain a skeptical perspective, always looking for rational explanations before accepting that something genuinely unusual was occurring. But over his 22 years of attending to the clock, he became convinced that it existed in some kind of anomalous state, that it marked a location where normal physical laws were somehow bent or suspended, where time itself behaved differently than elsewhere. The stopped clock survived World War I without damage, despite the social and economic upheaval the war brought to Britain. Young men from Ashford Cross went off to fight, and many didn't return, but the clock remained frozen at midnight, unchanging while the world changed catastrophically around it. Some people found comfort in its constancy, a fixed point in a world that seemed to have lost its moorings. Others found it increasingly disturbing, a reminder that some things resist all attempts at repair or restoration, that some mysteries never resolve. In the 1920s, as technology advanced and new forms of entertainment and communication transformed British society, the stopped clock seemed increasingly anachronistic, a relic of the Victorian era persisting into the modern age. There were periodic proposals to remove it and install a functioning clock, or to simply dismantle it and sell the tower bells and mechanism for scrap. But these proposals always met fierce resistance from townspeople who had grown up with the stopped clock and couldn't imagine Ashford Cross without it. A particularly vigorous campaign to preserve the clock occurred in 1925, when the town council seriously considered removal. A petition circulated and gathered more than 3,000 signatures from current and former residents. all demanding that the clock be left alone. The petition argued that the clock had become part of the town's history and identity, that it represented a genuine mystery worthy of preservation, and that removing it would be vandalism against both the town's heritage and the memory of Heinrich Aldrich, Thomas Greer, and all those who had been touched by the clock's story. The council voted to preserve the clock indefinitely, to maintain the tower in good repair, and to continue allowing researchers access to study the phenomenon. This decision ensured that the stopped clock would remain a feature of Ashford Cross, at least for the foreseeable future, frozen at midnight while the town and the world continued to change around it. The phenomena associated with the clock continued through the decades, reported by new generations who experienced the phantom midnight bell, the time distortions, the sense of presence in and around the tower. Some of these experiencers were locals who had grown up with stories about the clock. Others were visitors who knew nothing of its history and were genuinely surprised by what they experienced. The consistency of the reports, spanning decades and drawing from diverse populations, suggested that something genuine was occurring, though what that something might be remained entirely mysterious. In the 1930s, a researcher named Dr. Helena Marsh conducted the most comprehensive study yet of the Ashford Cross phenomena. Dr. Marsh was a psychologist interested in temporal perception and anomalous experiences, and she spent 2 years based in Ashford Cross interviewing experiencers, conducting her own vigils, and attempting to develop a theoretical framework that could account for the observations. Her monograph, published in 1935 under the title Chronological Anomalies, a study of the Ashford Cross phenomenon, ran to more than 300 pages and represented a serious academic engagement with the mystery. Dr. Marsh documented the stopped clock's history, compiled every reliable account of unusual experiences associated with it, analyzed patterns and correlations, and proposed several hypotheses. Her primary theory, which she admitted was highly speculative, suggested that the clock stoppage had created what she called a temporal eddy, a region where time flowed differently than normal. She drew an analogy to whirlpools in rivers. Normally water flows smoothly downstream, but under certain conditions, it can begin rotating, creating a circular current that persists even as the river continues to flow around it. Similarly, she proposed, time normally flows smoothly from past to future, but perhaps under certain circumstances it could develop eddies or anomalies where the flow was disrupted. The stopped clock, in this model, marked a location where such an eddy had formed. Time hadn't stopped there. If it had, the tower would presumably be frozen, unchanging, incapable of affecting or being affected by the normal world around it. Instead, time was flowing in some kind of circular or recursive pattern, repeatedly returning to midnight, replaying that moment when the clock had stopped. This would explain why people experienced the midnight bell even though the physical striking mechanism was frozen. They were experiencing an echo or replay of the moment when the clock stopped, a moment that was somehow caught in a loop. Dr. Marsh's theory was intriguing but untestable with the scientific tools available in the 1930s. She couldn't measure time flow directly, couldn't prove that her hypothetical temporal eddy existed. But her framework did provide a way of thinking about the phenomena that made a kind of sense, that connected the various observations into a coherent if fantastic narrative. Her work inspired others to engage seriously with the mystery rather than dismissing it as folklore or delusion. Through the late 1930s and 1940s, Ashford Cross became a destination for researchers interested in anomalous phenomena, temporal perception, and the boundaries of scientific understanding. Not all of this attention was welcome. Some locals felt that their town was being treated as a curiosity rather than a community, that the serious investigation of the clock's mystery had given way to sensation-seeking and tourism. World War II brought new concerns to Ashford Cross, as it did to all of Britain. The town survived the war without direct damage, being far enough from major cities to escape the bombing that devastated London and other urban centers. But many of its young people served and some did not return, and the war years were hard ones of rationing and anxiety and grief. Through it all, the stopped clock remained, still frozen at midnight, still generating occasional reports of midnight phenomena, still resistant to all attempts at explanation or repair. After the war, Britain entered a period of reconstruction and modernization, and the stopped clock seemed increasingly like a vestige of an earlier era, a Victorian peculiarity persisting in the modern world. But it also took on new symbolic meanings. To some, it represented memory, the importance of preserving the past even when it cannot be fully understood. To others, it symbolized the limits of human knowledge and control, a reminder that not everything can be fixed or explained. To still others, it was simply a familiar landmark, part of the landscape they'd grown up with, as normal and unremarkable as the hills and rivers that surrounded the town. The 1950s and 1960s brought television crews and documentary filmmakers to Ashford Cross, eager to tell the story of the mysterious stopped clock to wider audiences. These productions varied in quality and seriousness. Some treated the story respectfully as a genuine mystery, others sensationalized it or presented it as quirky local color. But they all increased the clock's fame, making it known far beyond the Midlands, turning it into one of Britain's better-known unexplained phenomena. In 1970, on the 75th anniversary of the clock stoppage, the town organized a commemoration that drew thousands of visitors. Researchers presented papers on their investigations of the phenomena. Locals shared their experiences and family stories passed down through generations. A documentary crew filmed the entire event, capturing interviews with elderly residents who remembered the clock from before it stopped, with William Archer's descendants who shared his journals, with researchers who had devoted years to studying the mystery. That evening, as midnight approached, more than 5,000 people filled the town square and the streets surrounding it, all looking up at the clock tower, all waiting to see if the phantom bell would sound on this significant anniversary. Multiple recording devices were set up, video cameras and audio equipment, scientific instruments of various kinds, all trying to capture evidence of the phenomena that had been reported so many times but never conclusively documented. Midnight arrived. For a long moment, nothing happened. The crowd waited in silence, the only sounds being the shuffle of feet and occasional coughs. The clock face, illuminated by modern electric lights now rather than the original gas lamps, showed its eternal midnight. The hands didn't move. The bell didn't sound. Time passed normally, without distortion or displacement. And then, just as some in the crowd were beginning to turn away, disappointed, it happened. The bell sounded, 12 deep strokes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the square and through the bones of everyone present. The effect was overwhelming, thousands of people experiencing simultaneously the time distortion that had been reported individually for 75 years. Watches stopped or ran backward or sped forward. People felt frozen, unable to move, while the bell sounded. The moment stretched, becoming elastic, each stroke of the bell seeming to last both an instant and an eternity. And then it was over. Time returned to normal flow. The crowd stood in stunned silence, and then erupted in a chaos of excited conversation. Everyone had experienced it. There could be no doubt now, no dismissing it as imagination or fabrication. Something real had happened, something that affected thousands of people simultaneously and was recorded by dozens of instruments, though when the recordings were reviewed later, they showed nothing unusual, just silence where the bell should have been audible. This mass experience on the 75th anniversary became one of the most significant events in the clock's long history of mysteries. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that something genuinely unusual occurred in Ashford Cross, that the reports spanning 75 years had been describing something real. But it also deepened the mystery, because even with thousands of witnesses and sophisticated recording equipment, no explanation emerged. The phenomenon remained as inexplicable as ever, resistant to measurement and analysis. Through the 1970s and 1980s, research continued, drawing on new technologies and theoretical frameworks. Investigators brought electromagnetic field detectors, radiation monitors, infrared cameras, every tool that modern science could provide. Some detected anomalies, unusual electromagnetic readings at midnight, temperature variations that didn't match the ambient conditions, light spectrum anomalies in photographs of the clock tower. But these detections were inconsistent, couldn't be reliably reproduced, and didn't lead to any comprehensive explanation. The clock itself remained in its frozen state, unchanged after a century. The mechanism was still intact, still appeared to be in perfect mechanical condition, still refused to operate. Periodic examinations by horologists confirmed what had been known since 1895. There was no mechanical reason for the stoppage, no defect or damage that explained why the clock wouldn't run. It simply wouldn't, and no amount of expertise or effort could change that. In 1995, on the 100th anniversary of the stoppage, Ashford Cross again hosted a major commemoration. By now, the stopped clock had become a well-established tourist attraction and cultural landmark. The town had built a small museum dedicated to the clock's history, displaying Thomas Greer's logbooks, William Archer's journals, newspaper accounts, photographs, and artifacts related to the clock and its mysteries. The museum also included exhibits about Heinrich Aldrich and the art of clockmaking, about Victorian Ashford Cross, and about the various theories and investigations the stopped clock had inspired. The centenary celebration was even larger than the 75th anniversary, drawing more than 10,000 visitors. Researchers from around the world attended, presenting the latest findings from studies of the phenomena. The event was covered by international media, bringing the Ashford Cross mystery to a global audience. And once again, at midnight, the phenomenon occurred. The bell sounded, the time distortion was experienced by all present, and once again, recording equipment captured nothing definitive. The mystery persisted, now spanning a full century, witnessed by multiple generations, documented by hundreds of reports and dozens of investigations, yet still unexplained, still resistant to scientific understanding. As we approach our own present day, more than a century and a quarter since that August night when the clock stopped at midnight, the mystery remains unsolved. The clock still stands in its tower, still shows 12, still refuses all attempts to restart it. People still report experiencing the midnight phenomena, hearing the phantom bell, feeling time distort around the stopped clock. Researchers still visit, still investigate, still try to understand what happened and why. The stopped clock has become more than a local curiosity or historical mystery. It has become a kind of meditation on time itself, on the nature of moments and their persistence, on the way certain events seem to exist outside the normal flow of temporal progression. It represents the limits of mechanical understanding. Here is a machine in perfect condition that simply won't work. It represents the limits of scientific explanation. Here is a phenomenon witnessed by thousands, documented extensively, yet still unexplainable. It represents memory and persistence, the way the past continues to affect the present in ways we don't fully understand. For the people of Ashford Cross, the stopped clock is simply part of their lives, as familiar as the buildings that surround the square, as constant as the hills that ring the town. They've grown up with it, incorporated it into their sense of identity, learned to live with the mystery it represents. Some nights they hear the phantom bell and experience the time distortion. Other nights they don't. Either way, the clock is there, frozen at midnight, marking the moment when something inexplicable occurred in time, at least in one small corner of England, decided to pause and never fully resume. What does it all mean? Perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the stopped clock is meaningful precisely because it resists meaning, because it simply is what it is, a perfect mechanism that won't work, a moment that won't pass, a mystery that won't resolve. In a world that increasingly feels like everything can be explained, measured, understood, and controlled, the stopped clock stands as a reminder that some things remain beyond our grasp. Some questions don't have answers. Some moments persist in ways that violate our understanding of how time and causality operate. The clock that stopped at midnight isn't going anywhere. It will remain in its tower, showing 12 o'clock, silent but somehow still present, still affecting people who encounter it, still generating its inexplicable phenomena. Future generations will inherit the mystery, will conduct their own investigations, will develop their own theories and interpretations. The clock will outlast us all, frozen in its moment, waiting for something. An explanation, a resolution, or perhaps just the endless progression of midnights, each one bringing the possibility that tonight will be the night when the phantom bell sounds and time, for just a moment, remembers how to stop. If this story of stopped time and endless mystery has captivated you, if you found yourself drawn into the puzzle of what happened that August night in 1895, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Hushed History. We're here to explore the quiet mysteries, the unexplained phenomena that whisper rather than shout, the stories that persist at the edges of understanding. There are so many more tales to discover together, so many more mysteries waiting to be examined in the gentle light of curiosity and wonder. And perhaps, If you ever find yourself in a town square late at night, standing beneath a clock tower as midnight approaches, you'll think of Ashford Cross and its frozen timepiece. You'll wonder if the clock above you might stop, if time might pause, if you might experience that displacement that so many have reported, that sense of existing for a moment outside the normal progression of seconds and minutes and hours. Most likely, the clock will continue ticking, midnight will pass unremarkably, and you'll go on your way. But maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why some mysteries persist, why some moments refuse to pass, why a clock that stopped at midnight more than a century ago still captures our imagination and still, on certain nights, reminds us that time is stranger and more fragile than we usually dare to imagine. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may your own clocks keep reliable time, unlike that mechanism in Ashford Cross that decided, for reasons we may never understand, that midnight on August the 27th, 1895, was the last moment it would ever mark, the final time it would ever show, the end of its journey through the hours and the beginning of its eternal pause at 12. Until we meet again in another story, another mystery, another journey through hushed history, good night.